The story of Jeffrey Epstein does not begin with scandal. It begins quietly, almost invisibly, in the spaces where wealth, ambition, and power intersect. In the early years, Epstein appears not as a monster, but as a mystery, a man without clear origins who somehow slips into the inner circles of the world's most influential figures. The Epstein Files pulls back the curtain on how such a figure could rise, not through brilliance or innovation, but through proximity, secrecy, and an uncanny ability to make powerful people feel untouchable. Before the crimes, before the victims, and before the headlines, there was an ecosystem that allowed Epstein to exist and thrive. Born into a modest background, Epstein's early life offered no obvious clues to the future he would construct. He lacked elite credentials, yet somehow gained access to elite institutions. His brief stint as a teacher at an exclusive school placed him in contact with the children of wealthy families. And even at this stage, patterns began to emerge, patterns that would later become impossible to ignore. The Epstein Files suggests that his earliest success came not from skill, but from learning how to mirror the desires and expectations of powerful patrons. He understood quickly that wealth did not merely buy comfort, it bought silence. As Epstein moved into finance, his rise became even more puzzling. He claimed to manage vast fortunes, yet left little trace of conventional business activity. His wealth seemed to exist in shadows, offshore accounts, shell companies, and trusts designed not for growth, but for obscurity. The book emphasizes that Epstein's financial structure was not accidental. It was a deliberate architecture meant to shield both himself and those connected to him. Money, in this world, was not just currency, it was camouflage. What truly sets Epstein apart is not the scale of his crimes, but the scale of his access. He cultivated relationships with politicians, royalty, scientists, media figures, and billionaires. His private jets, luxury properties, and exclusive parties were not symbols of indulgence. They were tools. Each invitation created a bond, each favor created leverage, and each secret created dependency. The Epstein Files paints a chilling picture of how social capital can be weaponized, turning prestige into protection. Long before the public became aware, there were warnings. Girls spoke up. Parents complained. Police reports were filed. Yet time and again, the system failed. Or more accurately, it chose not to act. The book meticulously documents how early investigations stalled, how charges were softened, and how accountability evaporated when Epstein's name appeared alongside influential allies. Justice, it becomes clear, does not fail equally. It fails selectively. The narrative makes it impossible to ignore the role of institutions. Law enforcement agencies, prosecutors, and regulators are not portrayed as ignorant, but as constrained. Sometimes by pressure, sometimes by ambition, and sometimes by fear. Epstein did not need to threaten people overtly. His associations did the work for him. When power surrounds you, resistance becomes inconvenient. Silence becomes the safer choice. One of the most disturbing revelations in the Epstein Files is how normalization played a role in the abuse. Epstein's behavior, while deeply abnormal, was gradually framed as eccentric rather than dangerous. Young girls were described as assistants or friends. Payments were reframed as gifts. Abuse was hidden behind euphemisms that dulled moral urgency. The book argues that this linguistic manipulation was crucial, allowing horrific acts to exist in plain sight without triggering alarm. At the center of the story are the victims, though for much of Epstein's life, they were pushed to the margins. Their voices were fragmented, dismissed, or buried under legal settlements and non-disclosure agreements. The Epstein Files restores these voices not through sensationalism, but through accumulation. Story after story revealing the same patterns of grooming, coercion, and exploitation. These were not isolated incidents. They were systematic. What becomes increasingly clear is that Epstein was not operating alone. While the book avoids reckless accusations, it carefully outlines how networks function. Planes require pilots. Mansions require staff. Money requires accountants. Silence requires cooperation. The question shifts from how did Epstein do this to how many people looked away. This shift is where the story becomes not just about one man, but about a culture of complicity. Epstein's greatest protection was not secrecy, but familiarity. He became a known presence in elite spaces, and once known, he was accepted. His crimes did not happen in darkness. They happened under chandeliers, behind gated walls, and within systems designed to protect the powerful. The Epstein Files does not yet deliver judgment. It delivers context. And that context makes what comes next even more disturbing. As pressure slowly began to build around Jeffrey Epstein, it did not erupt in a dramatic expose or sudden arrest. Instead, it surfaced in fragments, police reports that hinted at something darker, testimonies that repeated the same disturbing details, and local investigations that threatened to pierce the carefully maintained illusion of respectability. The Epstein Files reveals how close the truth came to emerging, and how deliberately it was pushed back into the shadows. This was not a story of ignorance. It was a story of intervention. In Florida, where many of Epstein's crimes were committed, law enforcement eventually compiled evidence that was overwhelming. Multiple victims described nearly identical experiences: recruitment through older girls, promises of money or opportunity, isolation within Epstein's properties, and abuse framed as routine. Detectives recognized the pattern immediately. This was not ambiguity. It was predation. The case should have been straightforward. Instead, it became one of the most controversial examples of prosecutorial discretion in modern history. Behind closed doors, negotiations began that would redefine the trajectory of the entire scandal. Epstein's legal team, stacked with elite defense attorneys, did not argue innocence. They argued influence. They argued consequences. They argued that pursuing Epstein aggressively would create unintended damage. The Epstein Files makes clear that this language was not abstract. It was a warning, one understood by those in power. The justice system, rather than acting as a firewall, became a negotiator. The resulting plea deal stunned even seasoned legal observers. Epstein avoided federal charges entirely, pleaded guilty to lesser state offenses, and received a sentence that allowed him to leave jail for most of the day. Even more disturbing was a provision that shielded unnamed co-conspirators from prosecution. This clause, buried deep in legal text, functioned like a legal eraser, wiping potential accountability off the board before it could even be explored. For the victims, it felt like betrayal formalized. What makes this moment so critical in the Epstein Files is not just the leniency, but the secrecy. Victims were not informed of the deal. The public was not informed of its scope. Oversight was absent. Justice, once again, was something happening behind glass, visible but untouchable. The book emphasizes that this was not a loophole. It was a decision, a choice made by people who understood exactly what they were doing. Media coverage during this period was oddly muted. Local reporting existed, but national attention never fully materialized. Editors hesitated. Stories stalled. Sources went cold. The Epstein Files explores how power does not need to issue commands to shape narratives. It only needs to create discomfort. When legal risk, social pressure, and access are threatened, silence becomes editorial judgment. Epstein remained a footnote instead of a headline. Meanwhile, Epstein returned to his life of luxury with minimal interruption. His properties reopened. His jet continued to fly. His social connections remained largely intact. To the outside world, the case appeared resolved. But beneath the surface, the damage was compounding. Survivors were left to process not only their trauma, but the knowledge that the system had effectively sided against them. This secondary harm, the harm of disbelief and dismissal, echoes throughout the Epstein Files with devastating clarity. The book also examines the role of wealth in reshaping accountability. Epstein's resources allowed him to exhaust opponents, delay proceedings, and reframe narratives. Lawsuits were met with settlements and non-disclosure agreements that exchanged financial relief for enforced silence. While some victims accepted these terms to survive, the cumulative effect was erasure. Each settlement removed another voice from the public record, another chance for truth to gain momentum. As years passed, Epstein became more emboldened, not more cautious. The lack of consequences reinforced a dangerous lesson. He was protected. The Epstein Files argues that this period was not a pause in criminal behavior, but an expansion. With legal validation and institutional backing, Epstein's operations grew more sophisticated. Recruitment networks widened. International travel increased. The same patterns repeated, but now with greater confidence. Officials moved on. Media moved on. Society moved on. The Epstein Files refuses to let the listener do the same. It insists on examining the cost of closure, when closure is manufactured rather than earned. Epstein is no longer just a predator enabled by wealth. He is a case study in systemic breakdown. The question is no longer whether the crimes occurred. They are undeniable. The question is why the machinery designed to prevent such harm instead became its shield. And as the book makes clear, the answer lies not in one office or one decision, but in a culture that values stability over justice and power over truth. For years after the plea deal, Jeffrey Epstein existed in a strange legal limbo, technically a convicted offender, yet practically untouchable. He moved freely, entertained guests, and continued to position himself as a figure of influence. The Epstein Files makes clear that this was not merely a failure of memory, but a failure of will. Institutions had chosen closure, and reopening the case required something they rarely tolerate: persistence from those without power. Persistence came from survivors who refused to disappear. Despite settlements, threats, and exhaustion, some continued to speak. Their stories did not change. If anything, time sharpened their clarity. They began to find one another, forming fragile networks of solidarity that transformed isolation into collective resistance. The Epstein Files treats this shift as pivotal. When survivors stopped speaking alone and started speaking together, the narrative began to crack. At the same time, a new generation of journalists began revisiting old records with fresh eyes. Court documents were unsealed, depositions resurfaced. Names once redacted became legible. The book highlights how digital archives and independent reporting disrupted the traditional gatekeepers of information. What had once been buried in local filings could now circulate globally in hours. Epstein's carefully managed obscurity was no longer sustainable. Public attention intensified as inconsistencies in the original plea deal were exposed. Legal experts began questioning not just its morality, but its legality. The Epstein files details how judicial scrutiny revealed procedural violations, including the failure to notify victims. These revelations reframed the case from a closed chapter into an open wound. Accountability, long delayed, re-entered the conversation with force. As scrutiny grew, so did the scope of the investigation. Epstein was no longer viewed solely as a local offender, but as the center of an international operation. His travel records suggested patterns of movement that aligned disturbingly with survivor accounts. Properties in multiple countries became subjects of interest. The book is careful not to sensationalize this expansion, but it does not soften its implications. Epstein's world was larger, more complex, and more deeply embedded in elite networks than previously acknowledged. Perhaps the most destabilizing moment came when powerful names were publicly associated with Epstein, not through rumor, but through documented connections. Photographs, flight logs, and correspondence forced institutions to confront uncomfortable questions. The Epstein files emphasizes that association is not accusation, yet it also underscores how proximity to power complicates justice. When influence is widespread, accountability becomes politically dangerous. Under mounting pressure, federal authorities finally acted. Epstein's arrest marked a dramatic shift in tone. Gone was the quiet negotiation. In its place was public spectacle. The book describes the moment as both vindication and tragedy. Vindication, because the survivors had been right all along. Tragedy, because justice delayed had allowed harm to continue unchecked. The reaction was immediate and global. Media coverage exploded. Public outrage surged. Institutions scrambled to distance themselves. Epstein, once protected by silence, became radioactive. Yet the Epstein files resists the temptation to frame this as victory. It reminds the listener that attention does not equal resolution. Exposure does not heal trauma. And punishment, even when delivered, does not undo years of neglect. Inside detention, Epstein faced a reality he had long evaded: loss of control. His routines were monitored, his communications restricted. For the first time, he was subject to a system that did not defer to his influence. The book presents this moment with restraint, focusing not on Epstein's discomfort, but on its symbolic weight. Power, stripped of its tools, reveals its fragility. Still, unease lingered. The case had grown too large, too complex, and too entangled with powerful interests to resolve cleanly. Questions multiplied faster than answers. Who knew what and when? Who intervened and why? The Epstein files portrays this uncertainty not as confusion, but as a warning. Systems that resist transparency breed doubt, even when they finally act. Epstein has been arrested, but the truth remains fragmented. Survivors have been heard, but not yet fully answered. The public is watching, but trust is fragile. What began as a story of one man has become a referendum on power, privilege, and the cost of looking away. The reckoning has begun, but it is far from over. Jeffrey Epstein's death did not bring closure. Instead, it detonated a final wave of disbelief, anger, and mistrust that rippled far beyond the walls of the jail where he died. The Epstein Files treats this moment not as an ending, but as a rupture, a point where justice slipped once again from the grasp of those who had waited for it the longest. For survivors, the possibility of direct accountability vanished overnight. For the public, certainty dissolved into suspicion. Official explanations emphasized failure rather than conspiracy. Malfunctioning cameras, exhausted guards, procedural lapses. Yet the sheer accumulation of errors strained credibility. The book does not insist on a singular interpretation, but it is unflinching in its assessment of negligence. When a system repeatedly fails at its most basic responsibilities, the result is indistinguishable from intent. Epstein's death, whether through incompetence or something darker, symbolized the final breakdown of institutional trust. In the aftermath, attention shifted to the network Epstein left behind. His associates, facilitators, and enablers became the focus of renewed scrutiny. Civil cases moved forward, allowing survivors to seek accountability, even in the absence of criminal prosecution. The Epstein Files underscores the importance of these proceedings, not because they offer perfect justice, but because they create a record. In courtrooms rather than headlines, fragments of truth continued to surface. Financial institutions, charities, and academic organizations were forced to confront their own roles. Donations once accepted without question were re-examined. Honors were rescinded. Partnerships quietly dissolved. Yet the book notes the limits of reputational consequences. Public distancing is not the same as accountability. Apologies do not replace prevention. And reform, when driven by embarrassment rather than ethics, is often superficial. What emerges most powerfully in this final section is the centrality of the survivors' voices. Freed from the immediate shadow of Epstein himself, their stories gained renewed clarity. They spoke not only of abuse, but of the long-term damage inflicted by disbelief, delays, and dismissal. The Epstein Files insists that trauma does not end when the abuse stops. It deepens when institutions fail to respond. Recognition, even years later, becomes an act of restoration. The case also prompted a broader cultural reckoning. Conversations about consent, power imbalance, and exploitation moved from the margins to the mainstream. The book situates Epstein within a larger pattern, arguing that his crimes were extreme but not isolated. Wherever power concentrates without oversight, abuse finds opportunity. The danger lies not in exceptional villains, but in ordinary systems that reward silence. Legal reforms followed, though unevenly. Some jurisdictions strengthened victims' rights, expanded statutes of limitations, and increased transparency in plea negotiations. The Epstein Files remains cautious in its optimism. Laws can change, but culture is slower. Without vigilance, reforms risk becoming symbolic gestures rather than structural shifts. Perhaps the most haunting legacy of the Epstein Files is its unanswered questions. Names remain undisclosed. Documents remain sealed. Lines of inquiry remain incomplete. The book does not frame this as failure, but as responsibility transferred. Truth, it suggests, is not a single revelation, but a process, one that requires sustained attention long after headlines fade. As the narrative closes, the listener is left not with resolution, but with a challenge. Epstein's story exposes the fragility of justice when confronted by wealth and influence. It reveals how easily systems bend, how quietly harm can be normalized, and how costly silence can become. But it also shows the power of persistence. of survivors who refuse to disappear, and of truth that, even delayed, continues to demand acknowledgement. The Epstein Files does not ask for outrage alone. It asks for memory, because forgetting is what allowed the story to repeat itself for so long. And remembering, imperfect as it may be, is the first step toward ensuring it does not happen again.